So this is our first official video lecture that we're going to be using for the Math 7 Accelerated class. So let's get started. Today we're talking about variables. And we already reviewed a little bit about our coordinate points, which are two variables that represent a location on a coordinate grid. And the variables that we talked about already are x and y. Now the reason those variables are important is that they represent data within our coordinate grid. We're going to use this data, we're going to use those variables to make a coordinate grid that represents our data. And in this case, our data is the number of jumping jacks you can jump in a certain amount of time. So x is always what we call the independent variable. It's something that's not changing throughout our experiment, whereas y is the dependent variable. And that's because it is changing throughout the experiment. Now, let's take a look at the data that we're going to be collecting. We're going to be collecting the number of jumping jacks you can jump over a certain amount of time. Now, as we're doing that, we want to think about a couple things. So when you make your coordinate graph, the first thing you want to do is identify your variables. In this case, we have time, and we have the number of jumping jacks. Now the variable that's not changing throughout this situation, or it's not being affected by the other variable, is time. Time is always our independent variable, which is x, which leaves us to have the number of jumping jacks as our dependent variable, y. Okay, so now that we know what our variables are, we can label our axes. Our x-axis, we're going to label time. And our y-axis, we're going to label number of jumping jacks. The second thing you want to do when you are creating your coordinate graph is to make sure you identify your axes correctly. So we've done that. We've labeled our axes. And through that, we're also going to create a scale. So scale your axes. A scale is an even interval that allows you to label your x-axis and your y-axis with numbers that you're going to be using. So, for example, in the sense of time, if I want to do jumping jacks for 2 minutes, I'm going to start at 0 seconds. And to go up to 2 minutes, I have to go to 120 seconds. So an even interval that I see is 20. So I'm going to say 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, and then I have my 120 down at the end. So you want to make sure that your data points are evenly spaced along your axis. And the same thing with our y-axis. I personally don't think I can do more than 100 jumping jacks in 2 minutes. So I'm going to label my y-axis in an interval of 10. And I'm going to stop when I get to 100. Great. So the last thing you want to do when you're creating a coordinate grid is you're going to plot your coordinate points. So let's do a couple examples. After 0 seconds, I jumped 15. Oops. I'm sorry. At 0 seconds, I didn't jump any jumping jacks. At 10 seconds, I jumped about 15 jumping jacks. And let's say at 50 seconds, I jumped 45 jumping jacks. I'm going to use my vertical and horizontal lines to guide me again. A good way to do this at home is with a ruler, or if you don't think that you need guidance with a straight edge, that's fine. Just make sure you're being very careful when you're counting on your coordinate grid, on your graph paper, because this does get a little confusing. The first point that I'm going to plot is 0, 0, and that's very simple. That's right at my origin. The second point that I'm going to plot has a time of 10, or an x variable of 10 seconds, and a y value of 15 seconds. just halfway through my 10 and my 20 on the y-axis. So here's my second point right here. My third data point has a value of 50 seconds. And after 50 seconds, I've jumped 45 jumping jacks, which is right about there. So I'm going to plot that point. Okay. So again, I like to use a straight edge. It's not necessary. If you think you can do this without using your straight edge, go for it. It's probably keeps your graph a little clearer if you do it that way. Always remember to put a title on your graph. So, jumping jack data. That is underlined. And you are all set. We have just created our first coordinate graph. So what you can do is move on to stage 2 of today's classwork, which will be an online simulation of plotting some points. If you do not want to move on to stage 2, that's fine. That will be your first assignment when you get to class tomorrow. However, you do have the option to move ahead at this time. So I hope you enjoyed our first video lecture. Feel free to post comments, questions, any suggestions for how to make these a little more exciting, a little more informative and clear for you. Okay? Have a good day, guys.